It sounds like a false story, but it's really true. It really happened. On April 18th, 1930, the announcer for the BBC Evening Radio News said simply, "Today there was no news," and then cut to the music. That's a vanished world, because that's not how it is in Donald Trump's Washington. Here, there is always news, and most of it, unfortunately, is usually bad. This weekend on uh, Friday late at night, in what has become a pattern, the Trump administration fired the Inspector General for the State Department. Apparently, the Inspector General for the State Department had been looking into reports. The Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, had abused government resources to sustain his wife, who travels with him, which other spouses of secretaries of state have done. But he has also provided her with staff. He's provided her with an official role, and there are other complaints too about her behavior. Confronting, rather than address those complaints or allow the investigation to reach a conclusion that might establish the facts one way or another, Secretary Pompeo prevailed upon President Trump to fire the Inspector General late Friday evening. I think that is something like the fourth firing of an Inspector General, and three of the firings fourth firing in just the past few weeks, and three of the firings have been late at night on a Friday. We begin this week heading again into economic crisis, heading also into moral and legal crisis. Last Tuesday, the Supreme Court heard argument in the case that will decide whether or not the government will follow precedents dating back to the 1880s and honor subpoenas from committees of Congress demanding the president's bank and tax records to find out whether the president obeyed the laws that the president is supposed to be enforcing. Of course, we are consumed with President Trump's attempt to gin up accusations that former President Obama was mean to him and mean to his former national security advisor. I think the simplest way to understand what is going on in the so-called Obamagate accusations is, I said this on Twitter, that this is like Al Capone demanding that the IRS be investigated for tax fraud. That is exactly the thing that Donald Trump did. He wants to accuse other people of doing. He wants to investigate the cops. Well, for the good and basic reason that crooks always hate cops, and Donald Trump, crook, hates cops. I want to go directly to questions. There have been a lot of them. Thank you for that, and they are excellent and always thought-provoking, and I really appreciate them. I continue to be attentive to these questions. This coming 10 days is a busy period for me. I am releasing a new book on May 26th, and I hope you will find it worthy of your attention. I hope you'll order it and read it. And if I'd rather that you read it, get it from a library and read it, than order it and not read it, but ideally both. And I'll put in a small commercial here. If anybody would like a signed nameplate for the book, I'm clearly not going to be in a position where I can travel from place to place and speak and meet readers and inscribe books the way I would like to do. But write to me via the David Frum website, and I will get you a signed nameplate by ordinary mail. If you can, please upload or scan and upload a receipt, but I'll take your word for it either way. And just reach out to me there, and I'll get the nameplate to you. So here's the first question, is from reader Jeff. In recent weeks, we have seen national and state Republicans attack stay-at-home orders with legislative proposals, protests, and lawsuits. Oh boy. Often their objections are couched as a binary choice between public safety and economic activity. And Jeff then makes the point that this is a false choice. So what's the real endgame for these Republicans? If they could get restrictions lifted and the economy flounders under public fear and apprehension, what do they do next? What's their real objective? I think we often try to impute to people who are saying something that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, some sinister master plan. They must have something devilish in mind. But oftentimes they're just victims of false information. I mean, you'd like to think that the people who produce Fox are too clever to be victims of Fox, but you can be the victim of delusions that you yourself originate and know that you've originated. It's hard for people to live in a state of double consciousness, of saying one thing and meaning another, or knowing that one set of facts are true, but inviting other people to rely on a different set of facts. They become their own victims. They've built a disinformation machine that turns on its creator. I think it's also true that the people who are most susceptible to this message are under certain kinds of hardship. I mean, there's this myth that is being propagated by some people who should know better that this is what we're seeing here, some kind of class struggle between comfortable professionals, academics who are on salary anyway, and yeomen and hardworking people who are. That's obviously false, but it is true that if you own a business, and you may be a pretty well-off person, but you are watching everything you built shrink and maybe be on the risk of collapse. And if people you trust, if the TV channel you believe in, if the politicians you voted for, if they tell you this whole thing is much exaggerated, and if people just would be a little calmer, that they could come to your business and you wouldn't have to deal with all of these difficulties, of course people are inclined to believe that. And here's the kernel of truth. While it is a false choice, obviously that if the president announced or the governor of New York announced, it's all over, people wouldn't believe it. Are you going to go flying again so fast? No. But there is an element of conscious choice that we cannot wait until things are perfectly safe to reopen the economy. At some point before it is perfectly safe, normal life will begin to resume. And it's a political judgment, a prudential judgment, and to some degree, individual by individual, but in other cases that we have to make together. Where on that slope we need to take the risks. I mean, right now, Americans benefit from a more generous unemployment insurance program, an extra $600 a month, that allows people to stay home rather than work. But that program is slated to expire, I think, at the end of July. Does it get, without that program, millions of people are going to have to seek work again, who otherwise right now might be content to shelter in place and not seek work. So maybe July 31st is too early, but there's some point where the extra unemployment insurance does have to expire, and people have to be told, you do now have to seek work, even if it's not perfectly safe. And that is a political judgment. And you just wish that political judgment were in the hands of people who are less obviously self-seeking and less obviously ignorant than the present crew who manage everything. Reader Carol asks, if Trump loses in November, which he surely will, there's been much speculation in the media that he will not go quietly into the night. And then Carol asks, what mechanisms would there be to remove Trump should he refuse to leave? Well, once the Electoral College meets, and should the Electoral College certify the vote against Donald Trump, and that'll happen, that they meet sometime, I forget the exact date, sometime in the middle of December. At that point, if Trump refuses to leave, then he's in violation of the law. So his moment of opportunity is the moment from Election Day till the meeting of the Electoral College, when he can challenge and create commotion and try to prevent the Electoral College from certifying a winner one way or the other. But he has other options besides simply trying to find some way to avoid going, and that is stripping the place, taking everything that isn't nailed down. I mean, one question I think that is going to come up real early is, can the president pardon himself? If he loses, I think he will endeavor to pardon himself, and certainly pardon people around him. There'll be a flurry of politically minded pardons. It's never been decided whether or not a president has the legal authority to pardon himself or herself. The question's never come up. And while the pardon power, as written in the Constitution, looks quite absolute, there are thoughtful people who wrote many years before Donald Trump came on the scene that it would violate the logic of the constitutional structure to allow a president to self-pardon. And so that question is surely going to come up and be a very, very rancorous one should Donald Trump lose. And of course, he will try to smash up the American political system on the way out, hurl every accusation. If the outcome is not close, if the Republicans have also lost the Senate, then Donald Trump will have fewer political resources with which to cause trouble, but trouble is to be expected. And we won't be able to sleep safely until someone else has been sworn in as the next president of the United States. A reader named Kristen asks, you spoke earlier about how many of our fellow Americans are going to need our forgiveness once this is over. I believe that, to be forgiven, one must first accept responsibility. A number of public figures I respect are saying we must look forward, not back, to rebuild our institutions and society. What is the post-Trump process you see for accountability, forgiveness, and rebuilding? And then he or she asks, I am at a loss in understanding how it is possible for the country to recover when at least 40% of the population think Trump and his administration's wanton destructions of our institutions, our alliances, our political and social fabric is not only acceptable, but desirable. I really do not understand how or if it will be possible for us to come back from this. So I'm going to insert here a theory, and it's only a theory of mine, about how democratic structures work. When you see that some percentage, 40%, let's say, of the population approve Donald Trump, they're giving him permission, but it's not necessarily to do what he's doing, and that is on them. But that doesn't mean they're enthusiastically in favor of it, or even in favor of it all, or even aware of it all. That democracy is much more a matter of a government that governs and a public opinion that accepts what that government does. And it may accept it enthusiastically, it may accept it grudgingly. There's no way to answer all that we know. It's democracy is like a machine that gives you yes and no answers. And it doesn't say how much, how far, how enthusiastic. It doesn't say when people are doing this as a result of a choice between lesser evils. We know that people allow Donald Trump to do this. And I certainly, when I say talk about forgiveness, I don't mean to forgive people like Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan, who did this all with their eyes perfectly open. The personalities at Fox News, I mean, they knew what they were doing, and they reaped considerable rewards for it. But a lot of people are just, as we all are, and I don't want to set some of us up as more sophisticated than others. We approve to the extent that we have knowledge, and how much knowledge we have is a difficult choice in a world in which our time is finite and the claims on our time are not. We are going to have to find ways to make the society continue to work once Donald Trump is off the scene. And the kind of endless culture wars, where even a thing like, do we wear a mask over our face, that becomes a statement, both for those who do it and for those who don't do it. That is not a way to continue a stable country. So I hope that we are going to be in a calmer period, and I hope one in which political differences will loom a little smaller than they have done. And that when President Lincoln called for malice toward none and charity for all, he did so after the country had torn itself apart in a much more terrible way than has done even in the Trump years. And yet he was able to find that place in him. And I think that's the spirit in which we need to approach what comes after Trump. So a reader named Joe asks, a friend of mine wrote in Marco Rubio, rather than vote for Trump in 2016. He said, the friend says he had a kind of spiritual conversion after reading the Flight 93 essay and now supports Trump. Have you read it, and have you any thoughts on it? I did read the essay. I happen to have been acquainted with its author, and I read the essay in draft. My footnote history, I tried to dissuade the author from publishing it. I said, you will regret this. I was obviously wrong about that. He does not regret it. Maybe he should have regretted it, but he doesn't. That essay reflected, like, if you're going to do something wrong, and not wrong in an obviously selfish way. I mean, a lot of people will, pocket loose change if it's unwatched. But if you're going to do something wrong from which you don't derive obvious or immediate benefit, you have to talk yourself into it. And when you're doing something as obviously mad as imagining that the guy from The Apprentice could be a good president, you have to build a giant burst of energy to persuade yourself to do this, manifestly crazy thing. I mean, even if you don't see Donald Trump as morally defective, I mean, you saw him on TV. He was a goofball. I mean, this man to be president. So that state of hysteria that famous Flight 93 essay invited, that was the rationalization and justification for a lot of conservatives to do foolish things, and they continue to live in that state. And I mean, it is one of the things you see it now with the Trump family trying to make of Joe Biden the most easygoing politician in Washington. I mean, the idea. I mean, it is hard to think of a less inflammatory, less divisive person, for good or ill, than Joe Biden. I mean, he's always been someone. He's been in the middle of the pack. He's been someone who went along. How you get people to be revved up about Joe Biden? But that's the thing they have to do, because the alternative is to persuade yourself that this goofball, or worse than a goofball, this goofball is somebody who could be president of the United States. I lopped off this reader's name. The reader asks, had Hillary Clinton won in 2016, do you think that the Me Too movement would have ever come into being? In the sense that if it started with reports on Harvey Weinstein in the press and knowing your connections to him in terms of the support he provided for a campaign, et cetera, could somehow this have been quashed? I do genuinely think that the Trump presidency was an accelerant for the Me Too movement, and part of it was that, yeah, I mean, simply not having the whole nexus of complications around Hillary Clinton and her husband and her friends made it more straightforward for proponents of the Me Too movement to bring the accusations that they did. I think it's also true that Donald Trump sort of intensified a lot of moral intuitions that people had, because I mean he was so obviously so cruel and abusive, and he was president of the United States, and on issues of how he treats women, he's been amazingly straightforward. That he has an ethic that, as he says on the Access Hollywood tape, he's entitled to do it, and he sort of feels that other people are entitled to do it. He's made it while people around him have been tweeting about Joe Biden. He himself has made it pretty clear, not a big deal as far as he's concerned. And he is always on the side of the abuser or the alleged abuser rather than the person who claims abuse. So I think that has been one of the benefits of the Trump years, that we are able to have this kind of moral reckoning. And I think one of the benefits of the post-Trump years is that we're going to have to now put this movement into some kind of perspective. The Tara Reade accusations are a reminder that women belong to the same human species as men, and that while people who tell of abuse are usually telling the truth, there are liars among women too, or fabulous, or people with defective memories, or people who say it happened one way and it didn't quite happen that way, and either they, since their memory has been altered, or maybe they're consciously altering their memory. But to do justice is always very complicated, and as we corrected injustices of the past by leaning toward more belief, that doesn't mean you accept everything at face value. And Tara Reade is a reminder of the risks of the terrible injustice you can do when you take every claim at face value, regardless of all of the reasons not to believe it. Josh in Vermont asks, altogether, the Russian election, he quotes something I wrote, which is that the Russian action to elect Donald Trump in 2016 ranks among the most successful intelligence operations in world history. And then Josh asks, doesn't that mean that Trump is in fact the most successful spy or agent in clandestine history? So I don't think Trump was in on the joke. I don't think he's a spy, I don't think he's a Russian agent. I don't think he has an awareness of all that they did for him. I don't think his mind allows him to process that. I think he's got obviously ideological and financial connections to the Russian regime. He has behaved in ways that are very hard to explain in any honest or patriotic way. But the idea that he is knowingly connected to Russian intelligence, I don't think that's it. I mean, would you trust Donald Trump? You wouldn't trust him. Why would Vladimir Putin trust him? You can use him. You can play to his ego. You can play to his greed. You can play to his desperation. You can flatter him, but you wouldn't trust him. And an agent has to be trusted. Okay, this question is a rather more substantial one, and let me try to edit it as I go. But this reader invokes the post-war order, the memory of what was built after World War II, and wonders whether it can ever be built again. And says, my fear is that it will take a generation of creative statesmanship to repair the damage that has been done, but I just don't see our political class producing the kind of men and women capable of providing the kind of imaginative leadership that's necessary. So my question, am I too pessimistic? What can we do to restore America's standing in the world? Where do we find the leaders of the necessary caliber? Well, the leaders of the period immediately after World War II had one tremendous advantage over other leaders, and especially over the leaders of the period 1918 to 1920 after the First World War, which is the response to the First World War had been a failure in almost every way you can imagine. It failed to restore peace, it failed to stabilize democracy, it failed to arrive at a workable financial settlement. So one of the things that you needed to do, so all you needed to do in 1945, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50 is say, did this question come up in 1919? What did they do? What if we do the exact opposite? And if you did the exact opposite, you were usually 2/3 of the way to the right answer. Now, we may have that advantage after Donald Trump. What would Donald Trump do? Don't do that. And you're off and running. But we're going to have a disadvantage that the post-war generation didn't, which is in 1945, America was not just the richest country in the world, it produced half of the planet's economic output. It was as rich as the rest of the world put together. And so Americans had the resources to do things that I mean, we're obviously a much richer country now in terms of the standard of living we provide to the people inside the borders of the United States, but the United States cannot pay for the rest of the planet in the way that it did in 1945, 50. Um, you know, even in the space of 20 years, that the United States has gone from being effortlessly the largest economy in the world to being neck and neck with China. And the counts I read suggest that China is maybe 80% the economy of the United States, but there are counts that now make it almost exactly the same, and there are even counts that make it larger. I don't believe those counts, but that claim is made. Um, so the United States is not going to be able to impose its will on the world. American leadership post-Trump is going to be leadership by consent. It's going to be leadership within coalitions. And so the task for the next president will be to be an effective coalition builder. And that is work that Donald Trump has never even understood. And to the extent that he's understood it, he's despised it and refused to do it. Uh, reader Tom from New York City. Oh no, sorry, I'm putting the wrong name on the wrong thing. Reader Sarah says, after many years of being involved in Washington political circles, what is your read on the current atmosphere and feeling about Trump? Have you seen a change in attitude in the last few months? It does seem like the Trump world is becoming more desperate, more frightened. I think it has occurred to them. I think in January and February, they really believed they had the election in the bag. They didn't have the facts behind them, but I think, really believed it. Now they understand they can lose, and now they can understand that they face real jeopardy. If Donald Trump loses, what happens to his business? If Donald Trump loses, what happens to Jared Kushner's Secret Service protection? I mean, that children and in-laws of former presidents retain their Secret Service protection for life, but their children only retain it on an as-needed basis, and they're certainly nothing like the level of nephew of the Sultan or son of the Sultan treatment that they now get. And I don't know that the Trump organization survives as an ongoing business if Donald Trump loses the presidency. So I think their mood is very tense, and you can see that with Mitch McConnell. I mean, I think a lot of the way to understand what Mitch McConnell is doing is that he's putting down predicates now for how he's going to deal with President Biden, partly by trying to get as many judges on the court as possible, and partly by rediscovering again the anti-deficit faith, the anti-spending faith that had been lost while McConnell and the congressional Republicans were confident in Donald Trump. They now think, oh, there may be a President Biden. Okay, so we have to be austere again. So that's my sense of the mood. It's hard to process the mood, though, because one of the real problems of the lockdown from a journalistic point of view is all your contacts are intentional. You call people, you talk to them in all kinds of ways, you read their work, but you don't bump into people in the way that you used to do. And just the bumping into people meant that there are people who were not exactly in your orbit, or people you maybe used to be more friendly with than you are now, but you see them and you talk to them. There are people you've forgotten; they've passed out of your memory, but then you encounter them in some circumstances, and your attitudes are refreshed, and you're able to travel and get out of the city and go to all kinds of other kinds of places and meet people doing all kinds of other things. So we're cast more on our own resources. Our connections are more planned, and that creates a kind of bias, and it's hard to overcome. The unconscious biases are the worst, and I freely admit that I'm as vulnerable to them as the next person, if not more so. Thanks for your attention in this QuaranChat. I hope to talk again soon. As I say, I hope you will find the Trumpocalypse book of interest, and write to me at davidfrum.com for the bookplate. And I wish I will. And maybe the day will come when we can meet in person and I can reinscribe it then, take the bookplate out and put a proper signature in. Thanks for your attention on this Sunday afternoon. And may the next week be as safe and secure for you as it possibly can be.